Salam and Khushamdeed to Naya. My name is Shuja Uddin, and you might be wondering, who am I? Well, apart from the existentialist nature of that question, I am a screenwriter, filmmaker with an MFA in screenwriting from Boston University. I've always been fascinated by cinema and the power it holds to impact and influence audiences all over the world. When it comes to South Asia, cinema has been instrumental in creating national identity, myths, and discourses for the post colonial nations of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Our collective histories are revisited and our politics are reassured through this lens of cinema, uh, whether it's border our collective histories are revisited and our politics are reassured through the lens of cinema, whether it's Border from India, Var from Pakistan, or Shomgram 71 from Bangladesh. Cinema has been the essential space for South Asian minds to play out the narratives that otherwise would not find space in our mainstream politics or our civil society. Countless research papers and books have been written on mainstream Indian cinema and the way it has developed modern India. However, when it comes to Pakistan or Bangladesh, there's a dearth of literature that explores the cinematic nation building in respective nations, as well as the porous exchange of creative talent all across the South Asian subcontinent, pre and post 1947. But then comes this amazing book, South Asian Filmscapes, Transregional Encounters. A good friend of mine had shared this book on our Facebook feed, and I instantly went out of my way to buy this book and reach out to the editors behind this book. This book, published by the University of Washington Press, is a collection of insightful essays written by Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, as well as foreign writers that explore the new national cinemas created after two massive anti colonial movements, the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan and the 71 Bangladesh Liberation War, and integrates the cinemas that intersect with nationalism, sexuality, gender, religion, and language. So that's a lot of me talking, guys. I'd like to introduce my guest here that we have on the show with us. So please, we have with us the one and only Elora Chowdhury and Professor Isha Niyogi Dev. How are you guys doing?
Wonderful.
Thank so you. Happy to have you guys here, and it's been really an honor to have you guys talk about these cinemas and talk about the books here. But first, I'd like to just give a bit of an introduction to our guest. So, Professor Elora Halim Chowdhury is a professor of women's gender and sexuality studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and author of Transnationalism Reversed: Women Organizing Against Gendered Violence in Bangladesh. And Isha Niyogi Dev, Professor Esha is a lecturer in English at UCLA and author of Empire, Media, and the Autonomous Woman, a feminist critique of post-colonial thought. So that's the introduction to our guest here. So first and foremost, I think it's very key that how did this book happen? How did it all come about? And I know there are some really interesting stories in the introduction. There's ISI involved, there's Dhaka University involved, there's even the war tribunals involved in Bangladesh. There's so much going on. It's a series of years. So please enlighten us in your individual journeys into bringing this, and then collective journeys into bringing this book to life.
Elora, do you want to start?
I think Elora has seen more the brunt of it, the political bureaucratic brunt of it.
Oh, not at all. I think, first of all, I just want to thank you, Shuja, and thank you, Naya Daur, for hosting us today. It's such a pleasure to be here and share some of this work. And thank you to the audience as well. I really defer to Esha in this question because I arrived late into the project. It actually started with Esha's Fulbright grant that took her across India, Pakistan, Bangladesh to study films, and particularly films made by women. At the same time, I happened to be working on cinema about the Bangladesh Liberation War, and particularly looking at women-centric films, and also films made by and about women and Muktijuddho. And also being Bengali and Bengali women scholars from both sides of the border, we did share a special connection, and we had been in discussion about films and women's films in general. So we were very interested in thinking about South Asia beyond the dominant narratives that frame it, particularly in the US, where we come to learn about South Asia through maybe post-World War II and Cold War politics, and really thinking about it as a civilization that is static and, in relation to the Western world and its strategic importance. On the other hand, in the region, there's also a tendency to think about South Asia in very country-specific ways. And our interest was really to move beyond those kinds of framings and look at the historical and political connectivities that form South Asian region across language, culture, religion, and that was really what gave birth to this book. And then, of course, we wanted to be in conversation with scholars in South Asia studying films. And one of the things we discovered is that how difficult it is to actually have conversations across borders, literally. And travel in itself is close to impossible in many contexts, especially between India and Pakistan, but also Bangladesh and Pakistan. And there are a lot of knowledge gaps. At the same time, there are also very fond memories and relationships that people talk about across these countries, family histories and community and kin that always come up in these conversations, and of course, which are also very much part of the cinematic imagination. So we began this process of hosting workshops in the region, in India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, and ran into quite a bit of difficulty there. Although these were very, very rich relationships and friendships that we developed, we also faced some very difficult statist politics in terms of crossing borders physically. And our inaugural conference, which was supposed to be held at Dhaka University in January of, I'm forgetting the date now.
I think it was 2016.
2016 was literally canceled 2 weeks before the conference by the Dhaka University administration. And this, I should mention, this was politically quite a difficult time, in the sense that the war crimes tribunals that were happening in Bangladesh, bringing perpetrators of the mass killings in 1971 to justice, were ongoing at the time. And I think, it made a cross-border discussion particularly challenging at that time. And the Pakistani press was quite critical of these tribunals. And at that time, the university administration decided that they would not really allow a scholarly exchange between the countries until and unless the Pakistani government issued an official apology for 1971. So, of course, we were very disappointed. And as you probably are aware of, it is scholars and progressive activists who, over many decades, have actually tried to organize around justice around 1971, and women's groups and progressive civil society groups have held various initiatives towards justice and reconciliation. However, many of the scholars that were involved in this conference also, equally disappointed, but did show respect to this decision made by the university, because the political situation is still such an open wound, if you will.
Yeah. And Dhaka University is the center of that kind of the events that transpired in 71. There's a huge history to that kind of university. So there's always an open wound. But I like to move to Esha here, and because she had a fairly easier time traveling between the countries, probably in around 2013 or 2014. So how was your experience, and what kind of status policies why did you not encounter some of the status policies?
Right, absolutely, yes. And of course, the reason I even thought of this whole project, it started with my Fulbright scholarship that took me to all these three, it was intended to take me to all these three countries. And I wanted to first start doing that, a 3-country project, because I'm a person of Indian descent living in the United States, and very important to me was moving across the borders, particularly in thinking against Hindu-dominant India, this sort of very strong right-wing Hindu nationalism, was something I was not. Therefore, I decided I have done my earlier work is on India. So I decided not to work only on India ever again. So then, how did I get to Pakistan? Yes. I am a person of Indian descent, and it all began with this wonderful person-to-person connection with a woman called Shamim at the window of the Pakistan consulate, not Shamimara.
Not Shamimara. There can be more Shamims in Pakistan than just Shamimara.
No. I'm talking about Shamim, who was at the window of the Pakistan consulate in Los Angeles, where I went to get my visa to Pakistan, because, of course, I had an American Fulbright scholarship. So as an American citizen, I went. But at first, it was very uncertain, because I am a person of Indian descent. It was difficult. And then suddenly, I was so disappointed. And then suddenly, Shamim calls me on the phone. I remember I was at the library at UCLA. Come on in. We're going to do it.
Yes.
It's a person-to-person connection. And then I went to Pakistan, and it was the best experience of my life. The generosity, the kindness, the welcome I received from everybody, not only people who are related to Fulbright, but definitely people who are related to the Fulbright program, but on the streets, in the chai shops. And so that, and then I was also connected to institutions, as a Fulbright scholar. And then I was connected to Jadavpur University in India.
Yes.
People were so eager in India, in Pakistan, and then when I went to Bangladesh, scholars in Bangladesh, to start a conversation.
Yes.
That was a big momentum. And then I reached out to Elora, whom I already knew, and then we said we have to do a cross-border project. And that is how it started, but it also started with Shamim at the window in the consulate. Yes.
And I completely relate with that, because when I went to India, at the Islamabad, in the Indian High Consulate, High Commission, it was just the last hour, they approve your visas, and then you just have to go and run, and you have your ticket and your flight's about to go. So it's always this sort of manic energy that comes with it. But that sense of release, and that sense of coming is so great, when that happens, But and you, I think both Elora and Esha, you both have visited Lahore. Did you go to other cities? Because I know Elora came to Lahore.
I went to Islamabad. But you see, the first time I was on a Fulbright grant, and then it is the US Fulbright. I mean, they're really a little bit strange, I must say, but they were very strong in restricting my mobility. And so the next time I went to Lahore, but I still was on an American Institute of Pakistan Studies grant the next time I went. By the way, I took my husband. The second time I went, I took my husband home. I said, "You have to get to Pakistan. I mean, they're the best people on earth." And he went as a tourist. But I was restricted. I wanted to go to Karachi, but because I was on US grant, I was restricted with the US Embassy. So I could never go to Karachi. I think Elora did.
I did go to Karachi on a personal trip after our conference ended in Lahore. In fact, I have some family there at that time, so I visited my family, also many old friends that I had gone to university with, so in the US. So it was a really wonderful reunion.
Amazing. I mean, so we can always talk about these stories, and there's so many stories of connection and reconciliation that happens. But coming to the book, right, the thing that both of your journeys have made this possible. Why was their book focused on Pakistani and Bangladeshi cinemas? Why was there a larger focus? Because for the viewers, there are 6 chapters on Bangladeshi cinema. There are 6 chapters on Pakistani cinema out of the 15 chapters in this book, and then 3 chapters on Indian cinema, and then 1 chapter on pre-partition cinema. So, is ISI funding you for the chapters on Pakistan? Is this Bangladesh intelligence that's making it happen? Why is the focus on the Bangladeshi and Pakistani cinema? Because
I can say a few words, and Esha, in fact, we were both very committed to having representation, equal representation, in fact, across India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. And of course, that was also fueled by the reality where South Asian studies is so dominated by Indian studies. And although when we went through these various workshops, and in each workshop, new people joined, and it wasn't an explicit mission there to have more papers on Bangladesh and Pakistan, because I think our focus remained that connectivities across the region. And nevertheless, we did pay particular attention to be in conversation with scholars who were doing that kind of work in the region. And it wasn't always very easy. And particularly our location being in the United States, we also, very easily are connected with other scholars who are in the US. So we had to work through those kinds of regional centeredness, transnational centeredness, and work to align ourselves and be in conversation for over several years with scholars, inviting them, and really even workshopping ideas and papers, and slowly this group emerged.
Absolutely.
Amazing.
Yes, and we also had good, very strong support for the sort of this cross-border connection building from Lahore alums, Lahore University, Management Sciences, and American Institute of Pakistan Studies. And the then President Kamran Asghar Ali was also very supportive of the idea. So, we were able to connect also through institutional channels. And then Elora did some fantastic work of making connections in Dhaka with scholars at Dhaka University. So some personal, some institutional efforts helped to bring this coalition together. Absolutely.
That's amazing. And it's really a delight to see, because a lot of the books that I've read on South Asian cinema have been largely focused on mainstream Hindi cinema, right? Rachel Dwyer is a huge name in that space, and rightfully so. But having to see this Pakistani cinema being talked about in ways that I've never read before, or Bangladeshi cinema, and getting introduced to that cinema is absolutely refreshing. But I want to just jump into the chapter that really that just changed the game for me when I read this book. And this is really an absolute delight, an absolute insight for a Pakistani like me who has been born and raised in Pakistan, who has seen cinema from a very particular lens through and even through the geographic borders of what is Pakistan right now. But this chapter in this book, there's this chapter called let me just pull that up here. It's, I believe, chapter 7, called Crosswing Filmmaking, East Pakistani Urdu Films and Their Traces in the Bangladeshi Film Archive. And it's written by Lotte Hue. So, as both of you are the editors of this book, why was this chapter included in this book? What was the reason behind it? Because there's so many fascinating untold stories, and it's really important to note that, to put things into context is that this is a forgotten cinema, largely forgotten by Pakistan, and Bangladesh has its own nationalist agendas post 1971 that it sort of has been swept under the rug. But many great filmmakers and many great actors, particularly Nadeem from Pakistan, came from East Pakistani cinema. Zaheer Rahan, Alamgir Kabir, who contributed to Bangladeshi cinema post 1971, they all came from East Pakistani cinema. Yet there from both the nations, we see that there is a sort of sweeping under the rug when it comes to this cinema. So why was this important to include this chapter?
Well, connectivity.
Right.
And the flows of artists, images, languages across borders that far overcome the state-imposed, the nation-state borders, state-imposed agendas that also have their own internal borders. I was saying, language and religion are internal borders, but that there is this, we wanted to bring out the idea of the trans-region, that the region is immanently connected, and people, imaginations are immanently connected, and they have been, and that Lotte's chapter really brings out the the consistent connectivity that was there, and it is still there. By the way, I will talk a little bit about that later. It was there even after that period,
Right. Yes.
Yeah. And the Urdu, the flow of languages was extremely central to it. So I don't know if Elora wants to.
Yeah, actually, I'm I'm not surprised, Shuja, that Lotte Hue's chapter spoke so closely to you. I think it's a really brilliant research and chapter that goes to the heart and spirit of our book, which is focusing on the connectivities, as Esha mentioned. And one of the things that Lotte points out in her chapter is the ways in which that the history of the two wings of Pakistan in that time period has also been slowly disappeared, right? So her quest in the archive to find the materials and the confusion that ensues. And when she talks about the director, Nazrul Islam, who after 1971 moves to Pakistan, West Pakistan, and settles there, and the whole history of his filmography is disappeared from Bangladesh film history. And those same films are also not recognized as Pakistani films in Pakistan, right? So in a way, we end up losing this very important history when there was such a dynamic interaction across the wings, and that filmmakers were also making films both in Urdu and in Bengali. And that history of Urdu cinema being made by Bengali filmmakers even was actively disappeared. As Lotte mentions, that in the archives, there is this sort of story that she hears about how each film, if it had any reference to Jinnah, for instance. So I think, for these reasons, for, contested histories and nationalist renditions of a country's history. Haque's chapter speaks so much to the heart of the book. And I'd also like to say a bit about Zaheer Rahan, since you mentioned him,
Right.
and his prominence at that time. And I think if you look at across the chapters in the book, particularly the chapters that are focusing on Bangladesh, his name appears and reappears over and over.
Right.
I think, you know, he appears on every chapter. It really goes to show that his very critical and important role as a leftist revolutionary writer, thinker, and a filmmaker. And I really particularly want to draw attention to the chapter by Fahmida Akhtar here, where she goes on to talk about Zaheer Rahan's film, Stop Genocide, which was made during the war itself. And she really deploys the cinematic traditions of third cinema, drawing on how the context and conditions produce a kind of story, and how Raihan was literally traversing across the borders, didn't have many resources, telling the stories of the war as it were unfolding. And very importantly, she draws attention to what an important figure he was, not only in Bangladeshi history, but also as a revolutionary filmmaker whose films also critiqued colonialism and imperialism. So this is someone, along with Alamgir Kobir, as you mentioned, who is really committed to revolutionary struggle that was happening across the post-colonial world, in the sense. I mean, we know Alamgir Kabir also joined the FLN and was actually also part of, similar...
FLN, which is the Algerian independence movement.
Right, the Nationalist
in Algeria.
Party in Algeria, right. And he also had ties to the Palestinian liberation struggle. And all of these kinds of thinking really infused war cinema, Muktijuddha cinema, the kind of work that Zaheer Rahan and Alamgir Kobir were both doing. So I think, in terms of our thinking about trans-regional filmmaking and film history, I think the work of these thinkers and filmmakers were particularly illuminating.
Absolutely, and I'd like to mention the film that specifically is being talked about, and there's a whole story about the film and the making of this film. It's called Son of Pakistan. That is mentioned in this chapter. Could you talk about what is the prevalence of this film? Because this is a film that, as we mentioned, is largely forgotten by both the countries, right? Both the nations. They didn't even know which language was this film in. It was originally called The President. Then, due to some censorship reasons, it's called Son of Pakistan. But as one of the interesting things is that when you look at Son of Pakistan's poster that we just saw, we see both the map of both the wings of Pakistan, right? Which shows that there was so much proliferation of talent moving across the borders, right? What happened there? Like, what was the story behind that? If you guys can illuminate the audiences here on that.
The Son of Pakistan,
well, actually, I don't think that Lotte ever found the film, right?
She never found the film,
Right, and I think, really what I take from her essay is that we have to learn from this confusion and the absence that ensued, and that, ultimately people were not really able to give answers, whether it was a Urdu language film or if it, there was also Bengali spoken in the script. And there was also, the discovery that it was actually also in English. So I think, the confusions actually speak to the cross-border silences and really willful absences, right? These were, as we also were just talking about, that many of this history was invisibilized
Yes.
post liberation.
Well, if I may add to that a little bit,
Yes, yes.
yes, this particularly with the son of Pakistan, it's a particular sort of, it's a gap. One needs to also look for these silences and gaps. But if one looks at Eastern film, a magazine being published in Pakistan in the 1960s, an English language magazine, a film magazine from Karachi, actually. There's a lot of mention of Zaheer Rahan's films, all these films that he's making, he's taking to Pakistan. It is it's a lost history that Lotte is also referencing, sort of, it is kind of a history that is being illuminated in the cracks that needs to be brought out more, because it is there. West Pakistan recognized these films, recognized there was a recognition that is now lost because of the border formation as well. So it is a lost history that we just started to, Lotte's chapter starts to trouble and bring to light as well, the lostness, it starts to trouble.
Absolutely. I think it was Professor Kamran Azhar who sort of recognized that this film might be in English, wasn't in English. In his recollection, I think was the idea that it was in English. But also the one other interesting thing that really was, as a Pakistani, I felt really sort of had this somber tone to it, was that we had the locations in Dhaka, we had those venues and locations that were accessible to Pakistani filmmakers pre 1971, and now because of the liberation war, that end of that filmmaking is gone. But then if we now move to the 80s, right, and that's where Esha's chapter comes in, because in 80s, as we all know, and it's being drummed down and Naya Daur every day, that Zia's era, Zia's era is the most regressive time that happened in Pakistan, that sort of changed Pakistan from then on. But Esha's chapter sort of changes the game here, because she says in her chapter, Action Heroines in Regional Gifts, Authorship Across Crossing Pakistan, this is the chapter that sort of talks about Pakistani cinema that's never been talked about, because whenever we talk about the 80s cinema in Pakistan, it's the Gandasa genre, it's the Maulajat cinema, it's the violent cinema that sort of took the middle class families away from the Pakistani cinemas. But here we have Shamim Ara, who sort of revolutionized the game and has been the forefront of feminine cinema, or being those leading film directors that changed the game. And Barbara Sharif, her connection with that, and the Miss series, the Miss Hong Kong, Miss Singapore. So would you elaborate on what was going on in Shamim Ara's filmography, and what was the reasons behind that, Esha?
Okay, yeah, definitely. It's finding Shamim Ara's archive in Pakistan during my Fulbright made me decide I have to work on Shamim Ara. I have to work on focusing Pakistan. I'm actually finishing a single author book on women's cinema, and focusing on Pakistani industry, and the brilliant talent of women such as Shamim Ara, Sangeeta. Let us not forget Sangeeta. That was in the emerging very strongly in the late 70s and 1980s. And I think one big reason for that is, with films, the video age, films were going to the homes and so the women audiences, Urdu speaking women audiences were increasing in Pakistan. And therefore, I was told by Salima Hashmi ji, Faiz Ahmed Faiz's oldest daughter, that whenever there was a film by Shamim Ara and Sangeeta, women wanted to see them. And so women went to the halls of Lahore to watch some of these, in the matinee shows, to watch some of these films made by women, But the other aspect of Shamim Ara's repertoire that actually I bring out in my chapter, and I've working more on that, is the travels, transnational travels of this
Yes.
small scale Urdu film companies. Rangila was another big player, big collaborator, such a
Right.
fantastic performer,
Yes. Yes.
so funny. And they traveled, so Shamimara made these contacts in Sri Lanka with other small scale women filmmakers, actresses, stars turning filmmakers, and then Bangladesh. I don't talk about that in this particular.
Yeah, that's not, yeah, but there's a mention to it, but yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
since
Yeah.
then, I've been working a lot on that. Okay, Bobita in Bangladesh, beautiful
Yes.
movies. So they
Yeah.
collaborated and films were dubbed in Urdu films, like Miss Hong Kong would be dubbed in Bangla and distributed
Wow.
and exhibited in the 1980s in the film halls, commercial film halls of Bangladesh. So once again,
Yes.
but it is totally, this was a small scale, like a film industry led by women who were also actresses and, collaborating across borders. They tended to avoid India at that time for a couple of different reasons. Actually, I got a lot of this information from Shamimara's associate director in Assam,
Director, yeah.
and he gave a lot of wonderful information for me. He used to travel with her. Well, it was also post 1971, so that border tensions were there with India very strongly.
Right.
And other than that, the huge sort of the rise of this gigantic Hindi cinema industry, which was really an action cinema, Amitabh Bachchan industry.
Yes.
That is totally cornering the regional market. So this small, Shamimara led women's enterprise, as entrepreneurs, you're interested in the film business aspect.
Yeah. Yes.
That was trying to capture the action cinema market, I think, of the region,
Right.
Traveling across borders, but in that process, displacing the extreme male dominance of in action cinema,
Cinema.
but Amitabh Bachchan style action cinema, because the Amitabh Bachchan style action cinema forces women to go back into the home. There is not a single action, and none of the women do any action. They're like, like dolls at home, whatever, or widows at home, or whatever.
Yeah.
That was very strongly decentered and destabilized by this women's. It's a small industrial movement, you might think.
And it's amazing to see that Shamimara was inspired by Enter the Dragon. Bruce Lee's Enter the Dragon, because there was this one scene that I saw that film recently. I was like, yeah, that's one scene could initiate this movement of cinema. Somewhere in Pakistan, this is happening in Hong Kong, somewhere in Pakistan, and she's watching this and she starts to go on this path. But I just wanted to backtrack slightly a little bit and ask Elora on this, that after the 1971 and with their loss of Urdu market as a film market, because of partition, because of the liberation war, did Bangladesh or the Bangladeshi cinema ever try to reclaim that market that they had due to Urdu filmmaking, whether the Hindustani market in India, or because that sort of the larger chunk of cinema was gone from there? Was there ever an attempt to reclaim that cinema, or was there any attempt to make that happen, like making movies in Hindustani language, either Hindi or Urdu, post 1971, or was that never a possibility?
Not that I am aware of, but I would mention that the relationship to Urdu is very fraught in Bangladesh. So I would be very surprised if there would have been outreach towards that kind of reclaiming. Because nationalist stories, as they are often told in a sort of a linear fashion, and the way that it is often told in Bangladesh, it does begin with this struggle over Bengali as the state language,
the language,
as opposed to Urdu being imposed as the state language, and the language movement of 1950 2 and onwards, and the resistance for establishing Bengali as the state language. And that really sort of, gave rise to the liberation struggle movement as well. So I would be surprised if, that kind of reclaiming was being done, because I think a lot of really deeper kind of thinking and really sort of, reckoning with the war and independence would have to happen before that could be a possibility.
Yeah, because Isha, as you're mentioning here, that Pakistan sort of gained access to the Bangladeshi market. So was that a possibility because the governments of that time, the Zia Ul-Rahman era, were they more Pakistan leaning, more Pakistan friendly? Were they more open to that kind of collaboration? Because Isha, Elora is rightfully mentioning that there is that point of bone of contention and sort of that happening.
Yeah. Well, actually, my answer to that would be twofold, perhaps. But one needs to also keep in mind that these companies, they're small film companies.
Right.
So in some ways, they are also kind of working through the interstices, through the chinks of
Yes.
these state politics, you see. And then there are these connections between distributors and financiers, distributors, and filmmakers. So I'm not sure that always either Zia Ul-Haque or Zia Ul-Rahman were able to control some of this, or were interested. Perhaps they were, they kind of shut their eyes a little bit to the transnational flows. There was a lot of transnational flows anyway, from because of videos, and with these little companies led by women, maybe people were kind of ignoring it also.
Right. Yeah, and that's always a possibility. Yeah, the cracks in the system, or just let there be some breathing room when that happens.
Yeah.
But moving on to Elora's chapter, that's probably the last chapter in this book, which is Ethical Encounters, Friendship and Healing in Contemporary Films about the Bangladesh Liberation War. A lot of people don't know about Bangladeshi cinema, both in India and Pakistan. That's sort of, even the book mentions that the scholars were sort of embarrassed to not know about what's happening in Bangladesh, equally in Pakistan, but also in Bangladeshi cinema. But there's a huge cinema genre in Bangladesh called the Mukti Juddha cinema, which is the liberation war cinema. And that is largely a masculine-driven, hyper machismo sort of cinema that rarely portrays women in a stronger role. The women gendered experience of that is not there. So, but your chapter sort of changes that perspective. And we have the perfect example of a film called Meher Jaan, which is probably one of those rare films that is a collaboration by these three post-colonial countries. It didn't happen before after their independence. Both their coming into being. Right, we have talent coming from India. Jia Bachchan is in that film. We have Rubaiyat Hussain, who's the director and acting in it, set in Dhaka. But we have a Pakistani soldier who's played by a Pakistani actor, and it had its own share of controversies when it was released in Bangladesh. But could you talk about what is the Mukti Juddha cinema? What are the new voices that are coming out of it that your chapter mentions, and what's the way forward with that?
Yeah, thank you. So my interest in women-centered cinema and cinema by and about women within the genre of Mukti Juddha is really what brings me to this project. And one of the things that I want to mention here, like we were talking about Zaheer Rahan earlier, that in the book, there again, Fahmida Akhtar, for instance, who writes about Stop Genocide and Zaheer Rahan's films, but also in other contexts, she and I both have written about Mukti Juddha cinema, and not so much the silence around women, because it is not that women are silenced or absent in these films, The trouble is that women come into the story through very categorical roles, where they are seen as victims, not agents in nation making or self-determination, and not political beings, in fact. So, and there is also the issue that many feminist scholars have written about. For instance, Anne McClintock, Cynthia Enlow, they talk about that nationalisms are violent. That yes, we can look at them as liberating, but the nationalism inherently itself is also violent, and
Yes.
women in particularly figure in very symbolic ways. So, for instance, looking at Mukti Juddho or war cinema, liberation war cinema in Bangladesh, these are very gendered stories, often hyper masculinist. So we see, the stories are about male heroism and female sacrifice. So there is this sort of, symbolic connection of women to nations. So the humiliation of a nation literally is embodied on women's bodies. Women are also essentially seen as closer to nature and as mothers who are sacrificing their sons for the war, and are also seen through this honor, shame, stigma complex. So what I tried to do is look at cinema that actually disrupts those kinds of essentialist ways of looking at women in the genre of Muktijuddha cinema. And a particular filmmaker who is also part of the parallel filmmaking genre in Bangladesh of the 80s and onwards, along with, it was started by Alamgir Kabir and, with such prominent filmmakers like Tarek Masood and others. We have Shamim Akhtar, who is a very prominent, well-known a filmmaker who has made multiple films about Muktijuddha, and all of them centering women. And one particular one that is very powerful and very relevant to the spirit of our book is Itihash Konna, or Daughters of History, which centers the story of a Bengali woman and a Pakistani woman, but who have very entangled histories. So the Bengali woman was born in Rawalpindi, and the Pakistani woman was born in Dhaka, had a Bengali mother, and they are reunited decades after Bangladesh's independence in a mutual quest for political justice. And it is through this encounter, this feminine encounter, in a sense, looking at a feminine space within filmmaking about Muktijuddha, that healing and even reflection and reckoning with 1971 begins to happen within this family. And by proxy in the nation. So I think that there are very powerful filmmakers in Bangladesh who are making women-centered Muktijuddha cinema. And you mentioned Rubaiyat Hossain. She certainly is one of them. And again, I think that the very strong hyper-masculinist reaction to Meherjan also goes to show that how hard it is to tell stories from the margin about the Muktijuddha, which remains a very sort of a sacrosanct space in even cinematic imagination in Bangladesh.
Absolutely, and there's so much going on in that kind of space. She's made in Bangladesh. There's so much cinema that's coming out that she's producing that is sort of talking about the people in the margin. When you look at any shirt nowadays, it says made in Bangladesh, but what's the story behind it? And she's really talking about those margins. But now, just for the interest of time, because you can go on and talk about this, but just briefly, if you can tell our audiences as to where do you see the cinema of Pakistan and Bangladesh going forward, right? How much of it the Indian cinema looms large, the mainstream Indian cinema looms large on both these cinemas, and how are they diverging and taking their own paths? Because when you look at Shongram 7071, I just saw the trailer, but it was like within the Mukti Juddo, you have a song and dance sequence in it, which I was like, how is that? How do you reconcile these two things? But I might be that there's a prevalence of the Indian cinema, the mainstream song and dance. So if you guys can just briefly talk about that, where do you see these two cinemas going forward?
Uh, can I quickly speak to the song and dance?
Yes.
It was very South Asian. I wouldn't. It is very much part of everyday performance traditions, village performance traditions, and
Right.
so it is really a different kind of cinema from Hollywood type cinema that we see
Right.
coming out of it. So I wouldn't say that it is only Indian influence.
Right.
I would say that it is a local, it is sort of a localized cinematic imagination through which all of these, like politics is being percolated, etc. But it's more, I would say, more indigenous, localized.
Indigenous, localized, yes.
Yeah, but not Indian. Not
Indian.
Indian. Yeah.
Let's reclaim that also. Let's give it back to everybody and not give it only India. But yes, where do you think is going now with the cinema? Both these countries, you guys have been researching on it.
If I may jump in here, and actually, I wouldn't really say that I'm well placed to respond to this question, because as I mentioned, I'm really looking at cinema of the margins, right? So I wouldn't dare to make a claim about Bangladeshi cinema in general. But one of the things that I will say, and I will refer to actually a chapter in our book by Kobita Chakma and Glenn Hill, a really wonderful critical chapter that critiques Bengali nationalism, which in itself has this hegemonic presence in Bangladeshi cinema, to the extent that the cinema about and by indigenous communities in Bangladesh has been severely marginalized. And they do a wonderful filmography of various films that have been made over the years and are being made, that are perhaps pushing this kind of Bengali hegemony in cinema.
Right.
And to that, I think I'm very attentive to that genre. And of course, there's Ong Rakhain, who has made My Bicycle recently, which has played internationally. And there are also other films in the making, and other filmmakers. And this is also a political question, that how much access and expansion in the cinematic imagination and industry is needed to really make room for a plural, diverse Bangladeshi cinema, not only in terms of gender, but also ethnicity and language and religion, across these axes of identity.
Absolutely. Esha, if you can just briefly sum up on, Pakistani.
Yeah, Pakistani, yes, absolutely. Yes, well, in Pakistan, of course, there is the new Pakistani cinema, Minugar, Farjad Nabi. Let's see.
Hopefully, one day Shuja Uddin one day can also contribute to that
cinema.
Yes,
absolutely. Yes. So that has its a transnational presence, and it's, I think, with these alternative platforms, and also mainstream platforms like Netflix and other platforms. Those are localized. Well, it's both localizing and transnationalizing Pakistani cinema for a transnational audience, an international, educated elite international audience. We have to make that distinction very clear here.
Right.
But at the same time, Lahore industry still produces. And I think that now, Lahore industry, which was focused, more, it had the Punjabi, Pashto, Urdu a little bit less, but those traditions, and they are still being made by the traditional filmmakers. And I think there may be some intersection going on between the more, sort of digital platform type films,
Yes.
the transnational digital platform type films, and this, because I was and the more traditional Lahore industry based films, which I think is a wonderful, progressive, syncretic, diverse conglomeration. Because I recently saw an interview by Sangeeta, who's one of the classic
Yes.
traditional
Yes.
Lahore industry filmmakers, but more television oriented, television programming oriented interview.
Right.
I found was a wonderful confluence of what used to be a little bit of a stratified industry, that it was more thought of as like local and a little bit lowbrow industry. I think
Lowbrow. Yeah.
yeah, but there is an intersection going on. So I think that is a very exciting future as well
No,
for Pakistani cinema.
absolutely. And with the prevalence of TikTok, and you see a lot of not in mainstream
Mhm.
Pakistani cinema or mainstream Pakistani media, that you have people from small villages telling stories about their lives, or we're seeing their lives in ways that might be very interesting, that maybe people in urban centers like Karachi, Lahore might not be exposed to. But finally, just to close off, and I'd like you guys to really talk about this, because this is a really key, important fact, and this is our audiences both in Pakistan and everywhere should know, that our both Elora and Esha have dedicated this book. Elora has dedicated this book to her mother, Shamsun Nahar Chowdhury. So, and Esha has dedicated this memory to her grandfather. Uh, help me if I pronounce.
Gananjan.
Jananjan Niyogi. So why have you? Because these people have, what this book sort of tries to talk about is the non-dominant narrative, the narrative that we don't see every day in public media. The nationalist narrative sort of takes over, the gendered perspective, but stories that one might not be exposed to. And these are our stories. These are generational stories. These family stories have made this book, these collaborations possible. So if both of you can just briefly talk about why it's important to dedicate this book to these two individuals.
Okay. Yeah. Elora, go.
Well, right. I totally agree with you, Shuja, the importance of family stories. And for me, I grew up in post 1971 Bangladesh. In fact, I was born in 1971 and during the war. And really, my mother, she has inspired my curiosity and um, nuanced thinking about women and resistance and agency and survival. She talked about her own experiences, her loss within the family and in the community, and the struggles that she endured during that time. And my father was also a educator and someone who was very involved in nationalist resistance movement. And so we have a lot of family stories from that time. And of course, both of them also lived through the partition of the Indian subcontinent. So
Absolutely.
I think the legacy of that trauma, also that spirit of nation building that comes from a liberation struggle, is something that really infused my generations, but also beyond my generation and my community upbringing and thinking. And it is really my mother's stories about that time that continues to drive my curiosity, because these stories were never really about heroes and villains. She had so many
Yes.
stories that um, really shows the intergenerational, inter-community intimacy, and which is really so critical to our journey in this book. So, that is why I chose to dedicate it to her.
That's amazing. And Esha, if you can,
Yes.
because
Okay.
there's a Muslim angle to this also.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. And of course, I never saw my grandfather. He passed away before I was born. So,
Yes.
yeah, it's my father's father. But this is, of course, a story from pre partition India. And by the way, one branch of my father's family used to live in Lahore in the 1930s and 40s. And
Wow.
yeah, so anyway, so I went and saw where they used to stay and all of that when I went to Lahore. That was so exciting. But returning to my grandfather's story, which is to whom I dedicated the book, to his memory, it's a pre-partition story, but it's a partition riot story as well, because he was actually a freedom fighter, but also he then became a social organizer, and he used to live in the middle of the most impoverished Muslim slum of Calcutta called Raja Bajar. My father grew up there, in fact, when he was little. And to give it was called Working Man's Institute, to give vocational training to the slum dwellers, because the problem in Calcutta is that high caste Hindus will not employ Muslims as domestic labor at home. So where are the slum dwellers going to get jobs? So that's what my grandfather was giving vocational training to them, and in this institute, so midwifery, tailoring, and so forth. And then the partition riots broke out, and for 2.5 to 3 days, the slum dweller Muslims encircled the home and fought off other Muslims who were coming, who were trying to attack, to protect and to my grandfather's family, and with immense loyalty. This was so important for me to remember at a time when I can't talk to my family members in India, because there's so much right-wing Hinduism sweeping across India. That is the memory that I had to reclaim. And I have, and I, establish myself on at this point, because I'm not able to talk to people in the country from where I'm descended. It is so difficult. It is so difficult.
And I think we're all in many ways more than one suffering from that nationalism, right, in our respective countries. And we're trying conversations like these, books like these, research like these, and creative efforts like these, sort of trying to break those national barriers, those nationalism, and bring together these different voices that sort of talks about the unity, and talks about our collective experiences, not just everything is black and white, what happened in partition and what happened in the liberation war. There's so many ways. I mean, I know, just to briefly touch, is like Kamran Saab's story, is Kamran Azhar Ali's story, is the opposite of what yours is, because his family was from Kolkata, right?
Yes.
And they weren't moved. So there's so many interesting stories here, but I can go on and on, but I have to wrap up this show now. But thank you so much, Elora, and thank you so much, Esha, for joining us. I think we could talk and on about this book and cinema and culture and politics. Maybe inshallah, some other time we'll definitely make that happen. And for people who are looking to buy this book, definitely go to the description down below. You can buy South Asian Filmscapes, Trans-Regional Encounters, edited by Elora Halim Chowdhury and Esha Niyogi. Thank you so much for joining. Have a great day, guys, and Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz.
Khuda Hafiz. Thank you so much for this, Shuja.